Well, while they're fixing that, this is not Saturday, and it is not the Sabbath, and we do not worship on the Sabbath. The Lord changed all of that. We worship on Sunday because Sunday is the day that he rose from the dead. Right? We no longer end our week thinking about God. We begin it thinking about God and the resurrection. The old is gone, and now we are living in the new. We're in the Gospel of John today. And we're going to look at something that we actually looked at last week. Well, kind of. There's going to be some familiar things. But there's also going to be some different things. And we're going to try and pay attention to the similarities and the difference. We're going to be in John chapter 2, which says this, John 2:13, "The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem." Now, Passover happens every year. It's the remembrance of God delivering the Israelites out of Egypt, right? And that's one of their greatest feasts. It's a feast that all of the Jews are supposed to go up to Jerusalem, and there was a pilgrimage back in those days. Everybody would come and worship together and remember who they were as God's people and how he delivered them. Notice it says he went up to Jerusalem. That's probably for two reasons. One, because Jerusalem sat up in the mountains. And two, because it's a sign of respect that you go up to the capital. So it's lifted up in preeminence. So Jesus is going up to Jerusalem for the Passover. Now, John is very meticulous about letting us know which feasts were taking place. He numbers them and shows them to us. We're going to be in John chapter 2. That takes place about 28 AD. That's going to be the first Passover that we have a record of Jesus attending. In John chapter 6, there's a second Passover mentioned. It doesn't seem that Jesus went to Jerusalem. At least nothing is said about it in the Gospel of John. And the final one, and this is the one we talked about last week, in John chapter 11, Jesus does go to Jerusalem, and that's the one where he goes through the triumphal entry, right? He rides on a donkey into the city, and he's challenged, and they want to arrest him, and they do arrest him after the Last Supper, and they try him and crucify him on that particular weekend. Now, we're not going to be talking about that one. We're going to be talking about this one. 2 years prior, he goes to Jerusalem for a Passover, and it says, in the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers were sitting there. Now, we talked about this last time we were together, but we probably have some people who weren't here, so let me just fill you in real quickly on what was going on. When the Jews came to the Passover, you had to celebrate by sacrificing a lamb, 1-year-old, flawless. If you're coming from all around the empire, trying to keep your lamb flawless is a very difficult thing to do. Like, they couldn't have any nicks, cuts, bruises, no flaws. So what the Jewish high priests did was they started a market in the temple. And they would pre-approve lambs that would be there, and pigeons and oxen for sacrifice, and you would just come with your money and buy them, right? And then you would give your sacrifice. The money changers were there because the Jews, for their temple tax and for these purchases, accepted only Tyrian silver, which was the purest silver of the time. So if you came with some other kind of money, you had to exchange it for Tyrian silver, and that's how you bought all the things and paid your taxes there in the city, right? So that's why money changers are going to be sitting there. Now, they're in the temple, right? And I did a little more study this week on the temple, and I want to just talk to you a little bit more about it so we get a picture. I always imagined the temple to be a tiny little thing like the size of the classic building, but it is a monstrosity. Plus, I have really cool pictures of it. So I wanted to share those again with you. This is a model of the temple, but it gives you a kind of a good picture of what the temple was all about. Now, when we talk about the temple, we're talking about the building itself right in the center. And we talked about how big it was, right? If you go back and compare Solomon's temple, which was a glorious temple for the ancient world, it was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. So a sizable building for the ancient world. That temple had to be rebuilt. It had been torn down by the Babylonians, and when the Jews returned to the land, they rebuilt it again, and this time they built it bigger, 90 by 90 by 90, like a big cube. So it was a very large building. Herod is going to actually tear that one down and rebuild it starting in 20 BC, and he's going to make it significantly larger. Right, 172 feet by 150 by 172 feet high. So this room here is like 23 feet high. So just imagine a building that is 6 or 7 of these rooms. It's just an enormous building. Now, I always thought, well, yeah, the Jerusalem temple, but it's a backwoods, culture. This is probably a tiny temple compared to other temples built by the Greeks or the Romans. I found out differently this week. I never knew this. Right? If you compare it, it's bigger than all of the other temples of the ancient Near East. When you compare it to the Olympian temple of Zeus in Athens, which was one of the big ones, although that temple was longer, if you compare the cubic feet, Herod's temple is twice the size of the temple to Zeus. And the other big temple, and this one was one of the ancient wonders of the world, the 7 ancient wonders of the world, the temple of Artemis or Diana at Ephesus, and that's mentioned actually in the book of Acts. If you're reading the book of Acts, you'll see a place where the gospel was being preached in Ephesus, and the silversmiths who made the idols for the temple of Ephesus were a little bit upset. Their union got upset because they said, hey, if this guy wins all of our people, they're going to stop coming to the temple and we're not going to have a job. So they lit a fire under the people, and those people in that city shouted for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," just shouting to try to shout down. Yeah, and you thought shouting people down was a modern phenomenon. Yeah, no, they did it in the ancient world too. But that temple was enormous, and although it's longer and wider, it still doesn't have the amount of cubic feet that the temple in Jerusalem had. The temple in Jerusalem was probably the biggest temple in the ancient Near East. Now, not just the temple building, that's what we're talking about there, but when you include the plaza that he built, that's even bigger. I want to show you how big the plaza is. I use ChatGPT, so I told it, hey, I want you to give me an aerial view looking straight down on top of our Capitol building at Washington, D.C. That's what this is. And I said, then I want you to overlay it with Herod's temple ground. I want you to show how big the platform is. Here it is. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you know how big that ground is. This is almost twice that size, right? And it's bigger than anything in the ancient world. When you go to the Athenian Acropolis, you've seen pictures of this, right? The Parthenon, it's a temple that's kind of fallen down. There's pillars that are all around. That was a very impressive temple. Now, the Greeks and Romans, they didn't focus so much on the plaza. They focused more on the temple. You're going in to the temple. So the temples were made big and impressive, but the plazas weren't all that big. So the Athenian Acropolis was 8 acres, which that's roughly what we own here at Mountain View. The Roman Forum was 5 acres. The temple of Artemis was only 3 acres, even though that was one of the wonders of the world. It had a very small platform. St. Peter's Square, it wasn't there then, but it's there today. But just for comparison, is bigger, right? Where the Pope is, that's 13 acres. When Herod built his temple, his platform is 36 acres. All right, so this is the largest temple in the ancient world. It is impressive. Josephus said that because it was made out of white marble, it looked like a pile of snow on top of the mountain, and the gold in it was so bright in the sunlight that you had to turn away. It was an amazing building that Herod put up for the Jewish God, the God of gods, the King of kings and Lord of lords. Right, so when you look at that temple, it's an enormous place. That platform across the front is 3 football fields long and about 2.5 football fields deep. It is enormous. And that, when Jesus comes in the temple, that's where he's going to come, and that's where he's going to find all the money changers. This is called the court of the Gentiles, right? So normally the Gentiles were excluded, but Herod said, no, we want to welcome them in. And he built this enormous court so that people from all around the world who weren't Jewish could come and worship the one true God, right? That's where they were supposed to come. And now Jesus is going to come into that platform, and instead of Gentiles, what he's going to find is rows and rows and rows of tables of people who have caged pigeons, oxen tied up to the big pillars that are there, sheep that are there in pens, and of course, and the money changers, tables full of, and people shouting. It's like a market. Right? And of course, when you have animals there, you know what else you have? You have the food for the animals, right? So you're feeding the animals, and of course it goes in one end and comes out the other, right? And you have that too, and you're walking around in sandaled feet or bare feet. So yeah, happy holidays. And that's what Jesus comes into. And he sees it, and he looks around, and it says, and making a whip of cords. And I just stop there for a moment. How long does it take to make a whip of cords? Can you imagine being the disciples with him? Jesus comes in, and you can see he's ticked off and just looking around. And he gets cords, and he sits down, and he starts braiding. And braiding, not talking to anybody, he's just braiding. I'd be thinking, oh man, who is this for? What did I do wrong? And he finally finishes the whip, and he stands up, and he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers, and he overturned their table. Okay, this is Jesus, right? Jesus. Gentle Jesus. Picking up the boxes of coins and just throwing them. Kicking the tables over. Yeah! Get out! And he told those who sold the pigeons, would you mind taking these away? No. My guess is he was, get these things out of here. They don't belong in here. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. And the word there is emporium. It's not a store. And he drives everyone out. So the Jews said to him, now I want you to watch this. The Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Now, when we talked about last time, right, when we looked at the last Passover, when Jesus goes into the temple and overturns the tables and drives the animals out, it wasn't the Jews who were talking to him, it was the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees and the elders of the city. This time it refers to the people, and they say to him, Not we're going to arrest you, not we want to imprison you, not we think you should be put to death, but what sign do you give us for doing these things? Now what that tells me is that the people at this point had not come to the place where they hated him or disrespected him. They're not trying to arrest him. He actually still is kind of thought of as a prophet, an upstart prophet, a new prophet. John the Baptist is in prison, but here's this Jesus who had been connected to John the Baptist, and he comes in and he starts like doing socially unacceptable things in the temple. But the people say, okay, we'll put up with this for a while. What sign? Show us you're a prophet. Do a miracle, perform a stunt is what they're asking for, to let us know that you have the right to do this. Now, when you look at the Passovers, right? The one where he gets arrested in John chapter 11, it was the chief priests, elders, and scribes that wanted to arrest him. Here, what we're looking at is the people, and they don't want to arrest him. They want a sign. That's a whole different thing. They were still favorable to him. This is John 2. When you go to the very next chapter with John chapter 3, look at what it says. John chapter 3, verse 1. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. So he's a powerful man. He's probably involved with the Sanhedrin, which was the council that ran the city, right? Along with the chief priests, but he is a Pharisee. He's not a Sadducee, but he has a lot of influence and pull. And he came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God. For no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Do you see that? There's no hostility here. There's searching, there's questioning by Nicodemus and we, the Pharisees. So they're not quite hostile to him yet. He's a very influential person. When you go later on, Jesus is teaching, he teaches Nicodemus some things, and Nicodemus is unaware of the things Jesus was saying. He didn't understand them. And Jesus said to him, are you the teacher of Israel and you don't know these things? Now, when Jesus says the teacher, that fact that he says the rather than just a teacher, he's not just any teacher. We would probably say he is the Regius Professor of Divinity and Theology at the University of Jerusalem, right? He is a very influential and smart man. He has probably memorized the first 5 books of the Bible and probably many passages from the rest of the Old Testament. He's no dummy, but he says, we know you're come from God because of the things that you do. So these people at this time are not quite hostile to Jesus yet. And it says the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? And Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, this whole enormous, truly wonder of the world, of the ancient world, this amazing place, he says, tear it down and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Let's remember that Jesus, when he is arrested 2 years later, Matthew and Mark tell us that story. And in that story, they say this. Now, Matthew and Mark say this. I want you to watch this for just a moment. Some stood up and bore false witness against him. This is when Jesus is arrested at that Passover. And there were people that gave false witness. And what did they say? They said, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I'll build another one not made with hands. So Matthew and Mark both tell this story that witnesses came and talked about Jesus tearing down the temple and rebuilding it. When you go to the cross and Jesus is hanging on the cross, Matthew and Mark both tell us, and those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So, do you see what's happening here? The people know that Jesus said this. Now, I'll tell you what's really amazing about this. These words occur in Matthew and Mark. Right there, what I just showed you. But nowhere in the Gospel of Matthew and Mark do we have Jesus ever saying that. So where did Matthew and Mark get the idea that Jesus ever said, "Destroy the temple and I'll rebuild it"? Well, that Matthew and Mark record the Passover at the end of his life, but John records the Passover 2 years before. So do you see what's happening? Matthew and Mark know about the story which John recorded. They just never talked about it. And John confirms that Matthew and Mark are actually telling you the truth. The reason I say that is, look, some people who they don't trust the Bible, and, well, John puts the story at the beginning of the ministry and, of clearing the temple, and he has it in the wrong place and so forth. No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. This happened twice. Once at the beginning of his ministry and once at the end of his ministry. The first time, the Jews were open to listening to him and wanted a sign. The second time, they wanted to arrest him. Two different things. So we're at that first one, where now they just say, "Hey, we want a sign," and Jesus gives them a sign. He says, "Destroy this temple." Notice he doesn't say, "I will destroy this temple." That was a mistake in their testimony. Destroy this temple. You or somebody else, anyone, destroys this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, we're not accustomed to temples. Churches and temples are actually two different things, right? A church is a meeting house. A temple was sacred space, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Jews or the pagans, the Greeks or the Romans, or anybody. A temple was space that was set apart from normal use, and it was for God. When you went to the temple, you went to talk to God. You went to hear God talk to you. In the Jewish culture, when you went to the temple, you were going to take a sacrifice so that you could get forgiveness of sin from God. You were going for cleansing from uncleanness, because that's where God was. Right? When you look in the Old Testament, the very first name that was given to this, when it was still a tent, before it was a temple, it was called the Tent of Meeting. Why? Because that's where God came down to meet the people. And if you wanted to know God, you went there to meet him. That's where divine transactions took place. You didn't just kneel down by your bed and pray and automatically have entrance to God. Right? You couldn't go just anywhere. You couldn't set up your own little shrine. If you wanted to go to the true God, you went to the temple, because that's where God meets people. When Solomon built his temple, we're told that the cloud, the Shekinah glory that led the Israelites out of the wilderness, it came down and rested there at the temple. God said, "Pray here. Come here and pray. When things go bad, turn to me. Come to this temple and turn to me." This is where you meet God. So they're holy, sacred spaces. And the whole ancient world understood you don't desecrate sacred spaces. Like it was a crime to deface So we're accustomed to seeing people deface walls, right? And now they turn it into artwork and do all kinds of stuff, paint all over walls. In those days, you didn't do that. You didn't do that. Nobody looked and said, wow, you're a great artist. They said, no, you deserve to die. And they would either exile you from the empire, or the Jews would stone you to death if you dared to desecrate the temple. That was it. The Romans would behead you, or run you through, or set you on fire. Right? You didn't tolerate that because everybody respected the gods or God working in the world, and this was his place. And now Jesus says, destroy this temple, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Wow, that sounds like a desecration. That's a very dangerous thing to suggest. And the Jews said, are you kidding? It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days. Right? So Herod had started building it in like 19 or 20 BC when he first came to power. And now it's about 28 BC. So it's only, or 28 AD. So it's only like 48 years. Right? And there's still more to go. They were still actually building the platform. It was still under construction at this time. It wasn't finished until 63 AD, 30 years after Jesus was there. And 7 years later, the Romans tore it down. 46 years this has been in building. You're going to rebuild it in 3 days? Okay. He is either out of his mind, or he's got to have some kind of special power. And they remembered this. See, that is why when he was hanging on the cross, they all heard it. The citizens of Jerusalem heard it, and they go out and they go, hey, I thought you had the power to tear down and rebuild the temple in 3 days. You can't get off of a cross? But he was speaking about the temple of his body. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Did you hear what he just said? See, in the Old Testament, if you wanted to meet God, you had to go to that building that was at the center of all the camps. The tabernacle, the temple, whichever one it was, you had to go there. If you wanted your sins forgiven, you took your sacrifices there. If you wanted a message from God, you went there. Because that's where God was, and that's where he met you. And now Jesus says, tear this one down. Tear this temple down, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Do you hear what he just said? He said, I'm the temple. Jesus called himself the temple. Don't look at this as the temple, this big building. This was something Herod built. If you want to meet God, you must come to Jesus. That's what he's saying. You won't be able to destroy me, he says. Tear this body down, in 3 days, it'll rise up and be rebuilt. Now, John writes that down, that Jesus was talking about his body. That idea that Jesus is God, Jesus is where God dwells, Jesus is where we come to meet God, that's just through everything that the New Testament teaches. And that's very strange, because all of the writers of the New Testament are Jews. And the Jews only believe in one God. And yet they said, no, Jesus is God. Right? When John starts his gospel, how does he start it? John 1:1. In the beginning, the minute you say in the beginning, everybody hears Genesis, right? Well, what happened in Genesis? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void. It was uninhabitable. And the Spirit of God was hovering on the face of the deep. And God said, words. This great Spirit breathed out his Spirit, and the Spirit came out in words, and the words created light and land and water and sky and animals. And God said. John looks back at that and he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So now he takes, see, when we speak, it comes out from us in these invisible sounds and words. And John says, yeah, well, that's God. But there's this other thing that's God, but it's not God. It's God. It's with God. And it is God. In John chapter 1, verse 14, just a little further on, he says, and the Word became flesh, took on skin, took on a body, and dwelt among us. You know what that word for dwelt is? It's he tented, tabernacled. It's the same idea that comes from the Old Testament idea of the forerunner of the temple. He says, God tented among us in a body. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. The only Son. Now, the easiest way, I don't want to demean God, but the easiest way I think we can illustrate that is if you think of God as a species, you and I are not the same species as God, right? You are not divine. And you say, but I'm a child of God. Yes, you're adopted. The Bible says that, right? That we're adopted. But I am not in my essence the same species as God. I'm a creature. When he says the only Son of the Father, he's saying the Father is God, but there's this other person who's also God, who's the same species. He's God, but there's one God, but there's a separate God who is one God. And he took on flesh and he came down among us. I've seen people make fun of Jesus praying. That, like, oh, when he prayed, he was praying to himself. No, he was praying to his Father. But the Son is God and the Father is God. So is the Spirit. But we'll leave that aside for now. And they said, we saw him. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a phantom. He was real. We ate with him, talked with him, heard him, touched him. We saw his glory. John 1:18, a few verses later, no one has ever seen God. Closest person ever got there was Moses. Remember that? Moses said, I want to see your glory. And God said, yeah, I'll kill you. If you look at me straight on, I'll kill you. You'll die. You can't take a full dose of me. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll let you see the aftermath of my glory after I pass. So like the tail end of my robe, as it were. And he sticks Moses in a little cleft in the rock, and God goes past and says, Jehovah, Jehovah, and he announces himself, who he is. And as he's passed and the last glittery glamour of brightness, Moses looks out and sees it. And that's Moses' claim to fame. I mean, man, nobody got that close. No one has ever seen God. But the only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. How do you know God? You come to the temple. That's how you do it. You come to the place where he dwells. And the place that he dwells is not Jerusalem, not some physical building. He is in Jesus. He is Jesus. He has come to make him known. At that last Passover, after the last Passover, Jesus is giving last instructions to his disciples, and he's telling them, I'm going away. And Philip, one of the apostles, says, well, how can we know the way? Like, how can we go with you? And Jesus said to him, I'm the way. I'm the truth. I'm the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. No one. No one. No one. Only through me. I'm the temple. You want to meet God? Come to Jesus. That's what he's saying. Well, boy, we really have trouble with that today, don't we? Well, that's really exclusive. Yes, it is. Oh, well, what about all the other religions? Look, I think sometimes what Christians do is they say, oh, all the other religions, therefore, everything about them is false and wrong, and yeah, they're evil, they're all evil and dark. No, they're not. A lot of them teach very good things. A lot of them are very similar to Christianity. And they teach nice spiritual lessons and nice moral lessons, and we agree with them. That's all wonderful. But I will tell you this, you can't get to God through them. All of those mistaken ideas of people that pick up little bits and pieces of truth all should point you in the direction of the God who came down and spoke to us and who revealed himself. We don't have to call everybody else evil. We just have to be able to say with Jesus, nobody comes to the Father except through him. I was always puzzled by this last line until this week. I'm more of an Old Testament guy, right? All my studies were in Old Testament. So the New Testament, boy, every now and then there's like really fascinating stuff to me. He says to his own disciples, if you had known me, you would have known my Father also. What, you don't know me? No, you don't. If you had known, you wouldn't have asked. How can we come with you? Are you in the dark? Yes, you're in the dark. The apostles were in the dark. They didn't get it. There were so many things that Jesus said that they couldn't figure out. And they're trying their best to put it together. And Jesus tells them right here, look, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. You don't come to the Father except by me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. How is it you don't get it? And then he says, but from here on out, you do know him, and you have seen him. Things are going to change. You know what's going to change? Jesus is going to rise from the dead, and all of a sudden, the missing puzzle piece goes click. And they get it. Look at John chapter 20. This is at the end of John's gospel. And it says in John 20:24, now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. So Thomas is the only one that hasn't been on to the... Oh, did you notice it's called the twin? If you have a King James, it says he was called Didymus. Didymus just means twin. So you know what that means? Thomas was a twin. I always wonder who his twin brother was. Right? Questions to ask when you get to heaven. We've seen the Lord. They all told him, and he said to them, unless I see in his hands the marks of the nails, and place my finger into the marks of the nails, and place my hand into his side where the spear went in, I will never believe. What is wrong with you guys? What have you been drinking? What have you been smoking? Right? That you think somebody rose from the dead? Are you out of your mind? That doesn't happen. You guys, there's something wrong with you. Thomas just takes the view that we all normally take. And then 8 days later, his disciples were inside. They're in a building. And Thomas was with them, and all the doors were locked. Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Shalom Aleichem is the greeting. We would say hello, hi. Can you imagine that? A guy comes through the wall and goes, hi. Even worse, he doesn't just come in and say, "Peace be with you," hello. He goes over to Thomas and said, "Here, you want to talk to me? Here, put your finger here and see my hands." Now, here's one of the amazing things that we forget. Jesus wasn't in the room when Thomas said that. And yet he knows that Thomas said that. Put out your hand. Here, put it in my side. Do not disbelieve, believe. And Thomas answered him and said, now remember, Thomas is a Jew. And he's a very rational Jew. He's a thinking man. He doesn't believe people rise from the dead because people don't rise from the dead. And he says, "My Lord and my God." He confesses, what else do I make of this? And Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you've seen me?" Well, yeah. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Who's that about? See, that's about you and me. None of us have seen Jesus risen in the flesh. The apostles and early disciples had a very unique experience. That as they were walking with Jesus, they couldn't figure out, they kind of knew there was something special, and they walked with him, and they couldn't figure things out, and then all of a sudden it clicked. We have never been there. We have always been on the other side where we're looking back and we hear their testimony. And we believe not on the basis of what we see, but on the basis of what we hear and the message of the gospel that is preached to us. John closes this way: "When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken." See, the resurrection changed them. And all of a sudden, everything came back. And Jesus said in the Gospel of John, in his last instructions, he said, "I'm going to send the Spirit. The Spirit will teach you. He will guide you into all truth. You will remember." And all of a sudden, they did remember. And they believed. Because it all made sense. Jesus is God. And if you want to come to God, you must come to him. There's no other way. Well, many of you here today are Christians who have come to that conclusion that that's true, and we worship Jesus. I know we also always have guests, especially on holidays, and you might look and say, "Well, I don't know if I can buy into this, like guys rising from the dead and all that kind of stuff." Well, it only happened once. So I understand that you'd have questions. I went through a period of life where I had questions too, and I started to wonder if these weren't just ancient stories, that these guys made up. Why would they make the story up? Think about it. When you read the Gospels, after Jesus is killed, what are they doing? Are they going out and saying, "We need to carry the flag of Jesus into the world and start a new religion that will unite all men"? No, they didn't do it. They hid. They were terrified that they were going to be arrested. They didn't want to start a new religion. A bunch of them said, "You know what, I'm going fishing." Because that's what they did. They didn't know where to go. They didn't have the wherewithal to do all this stuff. They lost their leader. He's gone. He's dead. It's over. We were misguided. We were delusional. What was wrong with us? They're going through all those doubts, and then they see the risen Jesus. And all of a sudden, everything's different, isn't it? All of a sudden, they are going around To the Jews, they're preaching the gospel to the Jews. They're being imprisoned. They're being threatened. They're being fined. They're being stoned. When it gets out, the message of the gospel gets out among the Gentiles, and more people believe in Christ, the Gentiles start persecuting them. They want to boil them in oil. They want to behead them. They want to crucify them. They want to crucify them upside down. And you know what? Every one of those men said, do your worst. Okay. I want you to think about that. Because they're not saying do your worst because they're representing a philosophy or a morality or a religion. They're saying, I don't care what you do to me because I know what happened. Our faith is not built merely on a morality or a religion or a spirituality or a philosophy. Those are all wonderful things. We're saying that something happened in our world. And these men are saying, you can do your worst to me because I have a confidence that this happened. If they made it up, don't you think one of them would have cracked and said, you know what, we all kind of made a conspiracy to start a new religion, so hey, don't kill me. Somebody would have broken, not one of them. Why? Because Jesus was risen from the dead. And they remembered, and it all made sense. And it lit them on fire. And now their message comes down to us. And if you're here and you never believed in Jesus, my challenge to you, you might say, well, Christians are a terrible example. Oh, I know, we are. We are awful. That's why we're here. We know we're awful. We know we sin. We know we fall short of the glory of God. That is the human lot in life. I'm not here to sell you on believing in Christians. I'm here to sell you on believing in Christ. And it doesn't matter whether it works for me or works for you or doesn't work for me or doesn't work for you. It's not about working. It's about, did it happen and is it true? And if it is, then we'd better respond. And we're told, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you'll be saved. Man, isn't it amazing how people come up with all of these elaborate schemes of spirituality, and all the things you have to do and all the rituals and ceremonies. And Jesus' message is believe. Here it is, in a moment, in your heart, inside, here, something where you trust him and you believe that he is who he said he is and that the message that he speaks is true. Because of the resurrection. And my prayer is that you buy that. You buy into that and believe it and trust it. And then let the Spirit of God direct your life and move you forward. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for coming into our world live, just live, and showing us yourself. And showing us who you are. We ask that you would draw us closer to one another and to yourself. And if there are any here who don't know you, Father, I pray that you draw them to yourself as well, to know how they are loved and forgiven and the future blessing that you want to give to all of us in a new heavens and a new earth, a new creation that has already begun in Jesus and in whose name we pray. Amen.